all the talking would be pointless and worthless if it didn't have the effect of bringing about some change. And remember, the speaking, the information, the concepts, which is what all teachings are, set of concepts, is essentially new conditioning delivered by life, not by any one separate entity, but by an expression of life, and each person is an expression of life. So the teaching is a set of concepts essentially being thrown out by life, and it hits another part of life and becomes part of change. And how the concepts land and what change they bring about is not in our control. A change happens or it doesn't happen. It might happen through or as part of the change, an insight might happen, and that insight might feel like, oh, I get something. And even that is a happening, because that getting something, that thought, that sees something clearly, is essentially the very complex processing of our intellect that has never been something that we've been in control of. So all the way down to our thinking, life is described in this teaching as a happening. And it's very important if we're going to start appreciating life as it unfolds, rather than seeing life and then having some imagination, some thought that says, oh, it shouldn't be like this, it should be different, and feeling in resistance to life. If that's going to fall away, it's very important to start seeing these micro dynamics and understanding that that is what is at play. So if we don't see those micro dynamics, then we'll keep assessing it based on the macro observation. And the macro observation may very much seem like there is a separate independent doer, a separate independent entity that has control. And so then blaming the other and thinking that they could be different makes sense based on how life is observed. And if we see the micro and realize that even my thoughts, my words, are not mine, who is the entity that is speaking? There is a sense of a me that arises as an output along with the words. But the words essentially are happening as a result of my, Roger's, genes and up-to-date conditioning. So when I say Roger's, we can say /life's. Roger is just an expression of life, like everyone else is a unique expression of the whole. And so if the teaching doesn't bring about some practical change, and the practical change that is highlighted is a change from suffering to peace of mind. If that didn't happen in the course of spiritual teachings, they would be pointless. And so today's satsang is really going to emphasize and focus on arresting in being, putting aside the concepts because they are delivered often, and balancing that out with a talking about and a pointing, not even a pointing, but a suggesting of what movements might happen during the day in order for the conceptual information that has possibly become part of your up-to-date conditioning to be part of a movement, a shift in a particular moment many times, not just one big sudden shift, but a movement of returning home regularly throughout the week. Now, regularly might mean in some hours it happens 10 times in an hour. And then there might be a day where it happens once in the whole day. Maybe a couple of days when we forget and get lost in thinking. And then after 2 days of having forgotten, we remember, let me reconnect. Let me stop. Let me drop out of a certain type of thinking. And this really should be quite an effortless practice. Not even a practice from a certain use of the word. It isn't a practice where there is a practicer that has to do this and do it well and use a lot of willpower. If that's the way it happens, I would suggest that forget about what I'm talking about, because that movement would be strengthening the very opposite of this movement I'm really talking about. So if the doer that says, I'm going to make this happen, I'm going to be the best at returning home, and I have to return home 10 times each hour. That's a sort of controller coming in. So what I'm suggesting is that I will describe what may happen from time to time automatically, because a thought just arises. And as the thought arises, another biological or thought movement can happen inspired by the thought. And so a thought could say, raise your right hand, and the thought arises, and then your right hand is raised. And it can be effortless. It's not where we are saying, I have to raise my hand 15 times a day, and therefore I have to think about raising my hand 15 times a day. It's if we start to see the benefit so this is the metaphor, in our hand moving up 15 times a day and seeing, that's a practicing of this movement that I haven't practiced for my whole life. And if we start seeing that, that increases my range of motion, let's say, and every time we remember, practice, our hand moves up. It's effortless. And when we don't remember, our hand doesn't move up. And then the thought is, lift your hand up. And so the hand goes up. And again. One more time. And then if it doesn't happen for 3 hours, that's fine. Or 3 days, or maybe a month. And then you remember, I haven't lifted my hand up. And again. But without it needing to look any specific way. And the lifting of the hand was just a metaphor that may show us that a thought can arise. We remember, this is good for my range of motion. So a thought arises. And in the case of returning home, the thought that feels most appropriate is the thought, I am. Now, for some people, the word I is very loaded with their old sense of self, because we have used the word I to refer to however we've known ourselves. And so if someone becomes aware that the I that they have known themselves as, a particular identity or way of thinking, is really what spiritual seeking is moving us away from, then there might be the thought, no, I am is not at all the right word to remind me of my true nature. I am is like the small me, the small self, the psychological identity that is always worried about the past and blaming and resenting and expecting, worrying. But if that's the case, it's because of a particular definition that the person has of I, and they might now see that no I, for them that might be the method, the wording that has been used through the process that's unfolded, teachings maybe, that so some teachings might say, the person, the I is the problem, the I thought is the problem. And what we need to know ourselves is the absence of the person or the absence of the I. And so it might refer to it as something different than I. So I'd like to point out why the word I am is appropriate when seen from a particular perspective. Because that might help when the thought arises, I am, which is just a reminder of return home to your true nature. Return home to I am, I amness. I am, so those familiar with Nisargadatta Maharaj's teaching, I am was a core part of his teaching. His guru, Siddharameshwar Maharaj, said to him, simple instruction, abide in I am. And Nisargadatta was a bhakti, basically in the path of bhakti yoga. There is great devotion to the guru, a surrender, trust in the guru, a doing whatever the guru says. In fact, a handing your free will over to the guru in a sense. It's a form of surrender, and it's a particular path. And so Nisargadatta's guru, who wasn't a bhakti guru, Nisargadatta's guru, Siddharameshwar Maharaj, was a jnana yogi. And Nisargadatta, I believe, came from a previous devotion. And so he had this bhakti attitude. And his guru said, it's very simple, just abide in I am. So Nisargadatta recounts, this was the instruction given by my guru. I trusted my guru. I had surrendered to my guru. I was a bhakti. So I followed the instruction. I abode in I am for 4 years. Now that doesn't mean that he dropped into some samadhi state and stayed there for 4 years and then self-realization happened. So that's what he said. He said, I would abide in I am, and after 4 years, self-realization happened. Now, my interpretation of what it meant was that throughout the course of his day, while seeking, he was a seeker, so he would be contemplating, he would be chanting, he would be doing all sorts of things, and at the same time he was also a cigarette wala. So he would roll cigarettes and sell cigarettes to people and make a little profit. And so he had a little hole in the wall in Mumbai, which was his shop. And so he was a householder and at the same time a seeker. And my interpretation of what he meant by I would abide in I am, and after 4 years the self was realized, is whenever the thought arose to return to his true nature, to the formless self prior to thinking, prior to knowing yourself as this or that, judging the world as right or wrong. Just dropping into the place from which life can be seen as a whole, and where that which is seeing the whole is really not separate from the whole, knows itself to be one with the whole. Now, it isn't so much about being one with. That's not the self-realization or the liberation. The dropping into that place is a place where the perception of life is a perception that knows that perceiving life from a place of attachment to outcome, perceiving life from a place of expecting someone to function the way that you would like them to function, is based on a very specific type of conditioning that life has more or less put in place across the board, and that it is attitude towards life that creates a psychological separation rather than a psychological harmony and a psychological flow. And what I mean by psychological harmony and a psychological flow is that at the very bottom of any thinking, we can always return back and understand, and this is how it is. And it makes sense that it's like this. And to the extent that we drop down to the bottom of our thinking, and the bottom of our thinking is, it shouldn't be like this, you shouldn't be like that, I can't understand why this is happening. If that is the attitude at the depth of our thinking, then it means that at the depth of our thinking that is available, there is just a lack of harmony, a lack of flow, a lack of being one with, which really means not being psychologically in opposition with what's happening. And technically, when I say at the depth of our thinking, it's maybe not completely right for me to say that, because actually when we drop past the thinking that is in opposition, what happens is we drop into a depth of the mind that knows that there is nothing to think, that there is just witnessing that doesn't require us to think about life in order for it to be known. And so dropping down into the depth of this place of being in harmony with life is actually dropping into a stillness, a silence, a mental silence, a psychological silence. A psychological silence means that the psychological me that is believed to be an accurate assessment or an accurate assessor of life, the psychological me has fallen away, has dissolved, has been seen to be a sense of self that misinterprets life, that assesses life based on certain conclusions about how things work and how things could be and should be, assesses life based on a sense of everyone being separate from life, being in control, needing outcomes to be perfect, needing life to transform from what it is now into some sort of ideal heaven like situation that is heaven on a circumstantial basis. So that's part of the psychological me, is mistakenly holding the belief that that's when we will be okay, that's when life will feel contenting. when circumstance sometime in the future becomes perfect. So if that's not who we are, if the potential is for us to be in harmony and at peace, content, fulfilled in life as it stands up to this point of development, as it stands with its imperfections. And what I mean by imperfections is that as time goes on, things that don't quite work will probably get better, will get fixed. And so relative to that, we could say, well, there is room for improvement, so it's not perfect. It's not perfect relative to. If we drop the relative to, it just is. And so the thinking mind is always comparing it to some idea we have about what we believe life needs to look like in order for things to be okay. And so we think that that should have already happened a long time ago. The absence of that thinking mind sees that life can't be any different to the way it is, that life is a result of the planets and the explosions of stars that created gas stratospheres that then at some point leveled out and created living environments or environments in which life could develop, and so on and so on and so on. And we now have economic systems, political systems that are essentially a morphing of all of that. And there's no doubt that there's room for improvement. And that improvement may happen as time goes on. Humans might, bring humanity to an end before that happens. But whatever happens, it's this unfolding of what's been put in place. And so being able to really grasp that, which means to see that our thinking that wants life to be different is based on not seeing things a particular way. And if we come to see them this other way, then we can quieten down the narratives that we had that used to pipe up because a circumstance sort of dragged a response out of us, a certain response. That response can stop happening because we've reprocessed life gradually, maybe. And we find that the response is different. More silence, more, yes, it's not perfect, but it is. And so this abiding in I am is a returning to the aspect of who we are that is prior to, or the aspect of ourself that is transcended from the thinking mind. It's a dropping out of the thinking mind. And that shift into this quietude is what is often referred to as the open secret, or the gateless gate, the unlocked door. And all of those references are pointing at the fact that in a way there's nothing in our way. It isn't a locked door that only certain people with special privileges and special IDs can walk through. You don't need to know magic passwords. So it's an open secret, means it's not, it's not secret men's or women's business. It's an open secret. However, you will also notice that there's a bit of a paradox in these terms: the gateless gate, the unlocked door, the open secret. Because from one perspective, and it's referred to, it's right here. You don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to gain a whole lot of new information, become very learned. So all the pointers are saying, you've been sitting on the treasure that you've been looking for all along. You've just forgotten that it's there. You just have to turn inwards. So there are lots of references that give us a hint as to what this is all about. And it's a bit like a door that you're pushing. And you're pushing really hard, and it just doesn't budge. And someone says, look, the door's not locked. It's not heavy. It's not jammed closed. Just open it. And you're doing your best. You're putting in a lot of effort. You're pushing and you're pushing and you're pushing, and it just doesn't move. And it doesn't feel like there's any chance of it moving. And yet, the reminder is, it's not locked. It opens so easily. Just open it. And on the pushing goes on and on and on. And one day it might just occur, like a flash of insight. What if I need to pull the door? And because all the doors in your life have been push doors, when someone says just open the door, the assumption might be, I have to, doors open by pushing them. And one fine moment, you pull the door. And it swings open like as though it's on titanium rollers. No effort at all. And you've spent years putting effort and struggle, pushing and pushing and pushing to open the door. And in hindsight, you look at it and you go, wow, this was the gateless gate, the unlocked door, meaning the gateless gate it's not really a gate if it's unlocked and anyone can open it. It's sort of like, it's a token gate, so it's not really a gate. And so we see how easy it is once it becomes easy. And we realize that all that effort was, in a way, for nothing. And it's not entirely true, because, you're pushing and you're pushing and you're making effort and effort and effort. And all of that is part of what leads to one day the insight that has configured the situation and you in such a way that the insight can happen. It says, pull the door. And so for us, on the one hand, we could say, well, I could have pulled the door 10 years earlier. And it's sort of like yes and no. it was always open, but the pushing was never going to open it, and you didn't pull it until you pulled it. Yeah. And dropping into I am is a bit like that. It can seem like this complete mystery, completely unavailable place, this platform, this essence, this gear that is referred to as our true nature. And frustrating as it becomes, it's like someone saying, just open the door, it's not locked, it's so easy, I can't understand what the problem is. That can become very frustrating, I guess. And so hearing that this is available, it's your true nature, if we just haven't found the movement, it's as if the door is locked with 1,000 padlocks, of which we have none of the keys. So one of the biggest hints is we're not going to be able to think our way into our true nature. We're not going to be able to think our way into being. We're not going to be able to think our way into knowing ourselves as awareness. Knowing the awareness aspect of the human being is another way of saying it, because I don't want to pretend that we are awareness. I would say we are a human being that is aware, is conscious, and therefore there is an aspect of the human being that is formless, is consciousness. And it's that aspect of the human being. I like this notion of it's the quantum aspect. The quantum aspect is the aspect that is on a different level to form and time and space. And so finding that aspect of the human being is what this abide in I am is referring to. And it's not something that we can figure out. In a way, it does take some thinking, but the thinking will only take you up to a certain point, and then the next point requires the absence of thinking, the falling away of thinking. What do I mean by the thinking is needed and will take you to a certain point? Just hearing these words is done by the faculty of the intellect. So the teaching, the pointers, are talking to the intellect and equipping the intellect. Hopefully, at some point, the intellect concludes, oh, I have to stop. Now, that part of the intellect, the working mind, is capable of figuring it out, because what is being said to the intellect is you can't think your way into this. But that's very important information, and at some point, the intellect, which is going to keep trying to think its way into it, because that's that's how we've known life, how we've operated. It's like pushing all the doors we know are to be pushed. And so the way we've lived life is to think about life, to observe and to turn what is observed into words. And then once it's turned into words and thoughts, judgments about that as to whether we see it as how it should be or shouldn't be. And so this trying to figure things out through thinking is the default. That's why, that's the equivalent of pushing the door. We're pushing, we're trying to figure it out by doing what we've always done. And the teachings are trying to tell you at some point you just have to stop. That your essence is, it very much exists, but it exists on the plane prior to thinking. We might not have realized that we can be aware of birds flying across the horizon, of trees blowing in the wind, of the whole vista, which includes both the trees and the birds and the grass and the people and the sounds of a building being constructed. So it doesn't just have to be nice nature, it's everything. An aeroplane, chemtrails, maybe it's just steam coming out of the back of a plane. All of it can be known without us needing to think about it. To just be aware of it in its innocence, in a way. If we are aware of it without labeling this is good or bad, maybe without even labeling it as an aeroplane or a tree. We might not have interacted with life through the simple awareness of what is. And in doing that, I would encourage an opening of the gaze such that there is no focus on any one thing in particular. Practice. If you're watching a television screen on the wall, open your gaze up so that you are aware of the wall around the TV screen. Watch some films where you are not drawn into the film. You might not have as impressive a film experience, because filmmakers design the films to draw you in, especially like a horror movie, draw you in, and then they scare you with something. And if you watch the television screen that's on the wall with an appreciation of the wall around it, and realize, that all of that can fit into the field of awareness. So when you're speaking with someone, you might practice allowing them to exist within a broader field of existence, where you're not necessarily so focused on the person at the exclusion of everything else. And this is part of opening up the system to appreciate the whole. And our home, the essence of the human, is much more synonymous with what we could call the heart than the head. So maybe there's the potential to be aware of life as it presents in each moment from the heart rather than the head. Now, what I mean by that is almost a quasi-physical sense. And we're not really talking about the physical heart, but more a location in the body And maybe it's not even a location in the body. Maybe we're talking about a location in the subtle body as opposed to the physical body. Nonetheless, there's a correlation between the different layers of the human being. They are maybe like layers in front of each other. So the subtle body, heart, is sort of in the same area as the physical body, heart. And it's very possible. It's very natural to be aware of life from the heart. There's no reference here to being in love with life or feeling love for life as a feeling. It's an encouragement to allow the sense of awareness, the sense of consciousness, the center of consciousness, we could say, to drift down from the head, which is where it has been dragged up to and found its sort of new home. So when we are thinking about life, we are perceiving life out of the head. And so if we continue to perceive life out of the head, we're sort of forced to simultaneously think about life. Because that's what happens when life is seen out of the head. This is further compounded by the fact that awareness is often conflated, mixed up, confused with the senses, as if they are the same thing, as if awareness and the senses are the same. And for this particular exploration, it's helpful to understand that maybe life is not known in the way that we assume it is. That maybe the senses are less fundamental to knowing life than another aspect. And because the primary sense, the sense that requires the most brain power, is vision, then if we assume that life is known because of the sense, the eye sense, the vision sense, then that too further drags us into the head. Now at night in dreams, there is awareness of visuals that are the visual components of the dream, and that happens without eyes. So it may not be the eyes that are aware of the trees and the people. But without awareness as an essence, not only a faculty, but a substance, a subjectivity, without that awareness, then life isn't known. And so awareness isn't located anywhere. It's not located where the senses are. If we want to locate it somewhere, I suggest let's start feeling it somewhat linked to the heart or to the chest, but not the physical, maybe even behind the chest, from behind the chest. That the seeing is happening from nowhere in particular, but maybe drifting down towards the chest, the back of the chest, behind. Maybe there's a sense that awareness is aware of the present moment from everywhere and nowhere. Maybe a sense that the body is actually an object rather than the subject. That the body is contained within the overall experience, the overall experience of life that is being registered by this awareness that I'm speaking of. And then just a quiet being with the moment as it is now, maybe sensing, feeling that it is known, not from the head. And if the thinking is particularly intense, which is dragging us up into the head and meaning that there's no frame of reference, what I'm describing can be palpably felt when the thinking isn't that active. And when the thinking is active, it has this effect of making what I'm describing seem very foreign. So if that's the case, I can suggest that what we call closing eyes could help, could be useful in this exploration. And closing eyes doesn't necessarily interrupt the thinking. It doesn't collapse the facade, the veil that thinking creates. And so my suggestion is to bring attention to what you might, through thought, refer to as the back of the eyelids. And not only the back of the eyelids, but maybe the place where your eyebrows would meet. And put attention there, which really means actually you can just, as if you are seeing it visually, see that space, see it with your, where you assume your eyes are, and look at the back of the eyelid, where the eyebrows would meet. And then realize that that maybe isn't the back of an eyelid. That rather, when you're there looking, there is this vast openness. Remember, at any time you can encourage the center of awareness to drop down into what now is very much maybe not got anything to do with the physical heart, but maybe it's got more to do with the subtle heart, the energetic heart. Maybe the center of consciousness in drifting down to the heart is really just drifted down into this vast open spaciousness. And what might become apparent is the center of consciousness is not separate from or different to this vast spaciousness, that there is awareness of the spaciousness by the spaciousness itself. And there's no need to try and imagine the spaciousness, to think about the spaciousness. We can't think the quantum level into existence. We can drop into it, which means drop out of thinking and drop into what is sometimes referred to as presence. So once again, if we've got lost in thinking, just bring attention to the back of the eyelids. Allow the center of consciousness to drift down into the heart. Look at what is there right here, right now. And see that it isn't the back of the eyelids, it's this vast open space that is timeless, that has no objects in it, no edges, no dimensions. That in this space you have no job to do, no problems to solve. That you might find yourself just drifting deeper and dissolving deeper into a world of no form. Don't need to do any thinking. Just dragged down into the depth of silence and stillness. And as we visit this dimension, this aspect of the human being, an aspect of the human being where certain faculties of thought, of perception, of senses are not needed and drop away, are not part of the experience. So a large part of what we know ourselves as is not present in that dimension of the human being. It's not to say that it has stopped existing in totality, but experientially it's stopped existing. And our problems, circumstantial problems, cease to exist, maybe just momentarily, when there is a rolling back into the depth of who we are. And so that becomes a resting place, it becomes a refuge, it becomes a ground that we can return to, and it isn't an escape, it's a remembering that the essence of who we are is much less conditioned by outcomes, by thinking, than the self that we have been dragged into and have lived life from exclusively. And it's not that we can live life or should live life in a closed eye meditation, but a dropping back here is a strengthening of the capacity to move back and take a break from thinking. And to the extent that we start to realize that so much of the thinking that happens is a thinking that at its core is an uncomfortableness with oneself and uncomfortableness with the other, is a thinking, a movement that disturbs life. And if we start to appreciate that, our true nature is to be quiet, to be still, regardless of what is happening in circumstance, and that in order for that to make itself known, to be a way of being in life, we first need to strengthen our familiarity with that aspect of ourself. And for a while it might need to be somewhere that we rest in the absence of daily living, because a lot of the visuals will force us to think in terms of our old idea of who we are and how life needs to be. So for a while it might be very useful to drop into being in such a way where there is no daily life. And as that movement strengthens, then what we will find is that there's a capacity to come out into daily life, to take part, to speak with people, to be aware of the visuals, and to not get dragged out of connection to that deeper part of ourselves. And when that starts happening, we end up with a much more integrated sense of who we are, which allows us to recognize, I am a human being in a world of time and space and form. However, I am a human being that has a depth to them, an essence that is not dependent on the outcomes. And because I'm familiar with that essence and can rest there, the thinking mind that used to be so forced into getting involved has atrophied. Because we know that so many of the things that we thought were important are not really that important. The volume seems to be spiking up quite high. So now you have to check number 3. I think the volume is too high. It should be on number 5. So abide in I am simply is a movement outside of, or moving out of thinking. And at this point, I'll mention that ultimately the thinking that is the real problem is the thinking of the thinking mind. And the thinking mind refers to the psychological me, the attachment to outcome and the doership. The thinking about the past and the future, thinking that I am the doer, the other is the doer, and that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. For the sake of dropping into being, it can also be worthwhile to look at the working mind as something that needs to quieten down in order for us to become more and more familiar with this silent stillness. When we find ourselves coming back out into life and interacting with life, we see that the working mind very much needs to continue to be part of our experience of life, and that the working mind, the functional thinking, is not a disturbance to our connection to self. It's not a disturbance to our peace of mind. And at that point, the working mind can come back in. And it is the thinking mind that we see is something that falls away permanently. And as we're strengthening this, it's important for us to at times drop out of all thinking. And then at other times we will see that you can't expect to live life without any thinking. Thinking, especially the working mind, is essential in order for practical tasks to be completed. And so that's when we'll start to see the difference between the working mind, which is the functional thinking, that does mathematics, that communicates, that understands how to solve certain problems, versus the thinking mind, the psychological me, that is filled with narratives and commentaries of guilt and blame and pride, worry and expectation, attachment to outcomes. And in that there is a lot of judgment of the other, that they should be different, that life should be different. And that thinking mind feels very uncomfortable. The working mind doesn't feel uncomfortable, but the working mind for a while might prevent us from dropping into that gateless gate. So abide in I am. My suggestion is, if we at any point remember, oh, I haven't returned home for a while, for a week or for an hour, maybe for 10 minutes. I haven't returned. It's been 10 minutes since I returned home. If the thought arises, the thought can be this I am, which reminds us of the essence that we are, the pure isness, the I-ness that is prior to I am this or that. So I was going to explain at the beginning why the thought I am, which is essentially the final thought that cuts off the thinking of the thinking mind and the thinking of the working mind. It's I am is like the bookend to the thinking that was happening, and it's a reminder to just drop into being. Drop into being, and you can maybe close your eyes if that's more useful, and bring attention to that vast open space. And in the presence, like being aware of that vast open space, you might realize there is no body. There is no person as a physical body. There is no time and space. No objects of the external world. You might notice thoughts arise, and there's the potential to see them as a thought arising in this vast spaciousness. You might sense that, there's a sort of half and half, sitting in meditation, and at the same time still there's a residual self-image of myself as a body sitting in meditation. And that residual self-image has a very powerful effect on the meditation experience. So to the extent that we can really focus on that spaciousness and become really present with what is in that moment, and realize there is no body. And so the residual self-image of myself as a body, for that, just for the purpose of that exploration, can fall away. We may not notice until we notice how this residual self-image, which is a deeply ingrained remaining idea of how I am because of how we've been experiencing ourselves our whole life, can interfere with our meditation. And in some moment we just realize, oh, I'm carrying in a self-image. And the way that gets dropped is if attention really becomes present with what is and realizes that the sense of the body, especially the visuals and the sense of touch, if we're sitting still, has largely fallen away. So from time to time in different traditions, when God speaks to humans, in the Bible, for example, there's the story of the burning bush, and it was Moses, I think, was, or maybe it was one of the other biblical characters. Who knows? Was surprised to see this burning bush that spoke to him, and he asked, "Who are you?" And the burning bush, which is a metaphor or a representation of God, replied, "I am that I am." When we really look into that, it's a bit like life is what it is. To just say life is to allow life to be without pigeonholing it down into being something. Because life is always changing. So if we say life is a sunny day, in the next moment a cloud comes in and it's not a sunny day anymore, or it turns from day into night. And so it just is. And so by saying it is, it allows it to be all of those things and none of those things. And so the response, I am that I am, is pointing at the basic sense of existence, the basic sense of I. That is, in this teaching, it says all of the concepts are concepts. Any teaching, anything anyone has ever said in all of history, the greatest prophets that you are familiar with, that you resonate with, they haven't ever said the truth. What they've been putting forward is concepts, teachings, whatever they've written down, whatever they've uttered, past and future and present, it's all concepts. And the only truth, and I use the word truth loosely, the only truth in the manifestation, in life, manifestation refers to waking life, is the impersonal sense of I am. And that I am is prior to I am this and that. Prior to I am male, I am this age, I am good at that, bad at that, successful, not successful, worthy, unworthy. It's pointing to a much more primal, much more fundamental essence. So much more of the I, we can know ourselves when all of the thinking falls away. And the why is I. Like if we only know I as the idea I, the thought I, then we might think it's missing the mark. But when we just drop into being and just rest prior to thinking, there is this one of the things that's often pointed at is the undeniable sense of existence, the undeniable sense that I am, not I as a person or as this or that, but something is. That is the undeniable in the manifestation. I is. I am. Now, to avoid this I confusion, because at some point it can be a confusion until it starts to become experientially known that, oh, it is I, it is I. I is perfect. We say I is not perfect when we're still sifting through the difference between thinking and being lost in thinking as opposed to being. And once the being is there, we go, oh, this being is I. And so if, Ramana in Tamil, in the Tamil language, doesn't actually have a word for I, from what I understand. Or if there is a word for I, it's different from the connotation in English. But nonetheless, to create a distinction between the idea of me as a person and a doer attached to outcomes, the personal I that people have become identified with, the self with a small s. In order to differentiate between that and the true self, or self with a capital S, Ramana introduced the word self instead of I. Or maybe in Tamil it's the word self, and there is no I, word I. And so when it's translated into English, and in Tamil also, to differentiate, he uses I and I. So the I is referring to the true, and just the single I is referring to the thought-based self. So he's double emphasized I, because when we drop out of the thinking into the being, it is this I am, it's undeniable. I exist. I am. And that's the core. That's the skeleton, you could say, or the very center upon which the rest of the human experience exists. Aham Svarana. Aham Svarana is a terminology that Ramana introduced somewhere. It's a very small thing. It's the bursting forth of I am. So aham is I am. Svarana means the bursting forth. And so this bursting forth of I am is the recognition of our essential isness, being, essential I amness. And it's called the bursting forth because we are unaware of it until we become aware of it. Often because of this meditation practice, this returning home and just resting in being. And at some point, the very undeniable sense of existence is recognized. And another way of saying it is the I am has burst forth, has burst onto center stage. And from that point on, now there is awareness of I am. Aham Svarana. And in his commentary, he, if I'm not mistaken and recall correctly from what I had read, it's made very clear even that is not enlightenment. that too falls away. Now, a purist would like to say, oh, you see, the I, even that I am, is too personal. So the interpretation is that even that falls away means eventually we will find the absolute where there is no I. I that's not my experience. That's how you would interpret it if you've got this idea that enlightenment is about the complete end of the person. In fact, in my experience, what happens is that for a long time, the beingness seems like what it's all about. It's where there is a refuge from suffering into being. As we ground more and more in that, and the old suffering habit, the various thinking, as the vasanas and the samskaras get worked out of the system, then essentially the uncomfortable suffering that we need to find refuge from, that we need to drop out of, isn't arising anymore. And at that point, the sense of impersonal I becomes far less necessary. And in fact, it may be that impersonal sense of I am, that very strong sense of being something that is not a certain age and a certain gender, at some point maybe that needs to be integrated into living and feeling like the physical human being, and at the same time recognizing in an integrated way, rather than in a way where the I is center stage, and living as a human being. And so this pronounced sense of I am and beingness can fade away. And we come back to being human, knowing ourselves as human, with much less emphasis on this formless being. So that is my interpretation of what Ramana means, where aham sfarana, even that falls away. It falls back into the background, and it's really pointing out that that is part of the transition, part of the process. It's a phase, and it's a very important phase. It's the ground on which we need to, build our home again, that allows us to break the habit of suffering, to pull the plug on the movement of suffering that is building and building upon itself. And that plug gets pulled by us dropping back time and time again into this place of being. So all of these satsangs are the new conditioning that may inspire a thought. Tomorrow, when you find awareness landing on the thinking mind, and there is a realization, oh, this is lost in suffering, it's not my true nature, and the thought I am might arise, that just allows you to become present with the present moment. Just like when you close your eyes, you can become present with that vast spaciousness. At some point, we can start becoming present with the visual image and drop out of what happened a year ago or 10 years ago that we're embarrassed about, or that we're resentful about, or that we feel shameful about, and come back to here and just be here and realize that the story and the person that is central to that story, which is really this psychological me, collapses. And we go from feeling uncomfortable to feeling free. The likelihood is we'll get dragged right back into that thinking mind until this movement becomes stronger and that thinking mind gets weaker and weaker and weaker. So I'll just address these 3 questions, and I won't dwell too long on the questions, and we'll leave it at that. Hello, Holger.
Hello, Roger. I wanted to apologize. Some days ago, some weeks ago, I messed up one of your Satsang recordings.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was in the, somehow I didn't turn off my camera, so I was in your picture next to you. And this was such an amazing experience because I was so embarrassed. It was interesting because something in me really died, and it relates to what you shared today, and this self-image, like a way of putting myself down and judging things that are really only existed in my thinking. And this was just so beautiful. This was really like, I cannot describe it, but it was just thank you. Really good.
Great. Well, no need to apologize, but apology accepted.
But wonderful.
So I'm glad that today's satsang was good.
All your satsangs are amazing. I mean, and I'm really grateful for them, and it does something. And more I don't have to say, just big hug, and don't give up. Thank you.
Thank you, Holger. Hi, Sharon.
Hi, Roger. Saturday I listened to you, and I found that I had this peace, and absolutely no thought would stick. Like it was almost, I'm in the background as a person, and awareness is in the forefront. And it was just like, wow, I really like, I was loving it. It was kind of like, maybe that's like I don't even understand what, how many times I might have had this experience, but this lasted the whole day. There was something in the teaching that that the self or the being had heard and just woke up, and then the next day I fell into, I have a diagnosis of fibromyalgia, and then it reversed itself, and I was in pain now this morning I'm fine, but I was in pain for a couple of days. Can you explain that? What happens like when you have such peace for a whole day and then you just go right back into, because physical pain wouldn't be pain if there wasn't a thinking mind talking, even if I'm not conscious of it.
Well, I'm not exactly sure about that. I would distinguish, you can have your finger in a vice and someone squeezing the vice. And the notion that if I don't think about it, it's not pain, or if I don't label it as pain, it's not pain, that set of pointers, that teaching, when a teaching says that, is really trying to show us that if we don't judge something, then there's a whole layer missing, right? A whole layer falls away. If you don't label it as pain, we can't then judge it as right or wrong. And to help us with that, the teaching sort of almost, not this teaching, but other teachings, and I'm not saying that they're wrong, it's a valid methodology, will even say that there is no such thing as pain unless you call it pain. In this teaching, we differentiate between the judgment about pain, the resisting of the pain, the psychological, this shouldn't be, as one layer, that's the attitude. The other layer is the biological layer. And so if your finger is in a vice and someone is tightening it, you don't need to label it as pain for there to be the physical sensation of pain. The physical sensation of pain is not a psychological movement, it's a biological movement. So pain in and of itself isn't going to magically go away because there's peace of mind. Peace of mind is the attitudinal harmony with the pain, understanding that pain is just part and parcel of life. So at best, what will fall away is our extra load on top of the physical pain, the load of guilt and blame, expectation, which is very significant. That extra load is very significant. However, I don't want to diminish the fact that people with conditions of physical pain, they can be very intense. So this teaching doesn't say that peace of mind means there won't be any physical pain.
Oh, good. Because, the mind that I'm in was, telling me that, of course, that I was failing because I've studied different teachings, and that, they continue to say that, that there's beliefs that I'm holding that I can't see, like trauma. And I have had a lot of trauma since the beginning of whatever this life is, as this organism was what was downloaded, and it was lots of trauma, and trauma just kept going. So I then I look and I say, well, what thoughts aren't I seeing yet? And then it just becomes a vicious circle where, I think in your teaching, it's like there is no separate entity. So why even beat yourself up? Take it out, etc. Who cares? I have a book that Ramesh has. It's called "Who Cares?" Because the bottom line is that we're not people. And one of the things I think I just want to address with you is, there's a lot of people that I, and believe me, they're all in my consciousness. I understand that, but they study the Course in Miracles and they're fighting with each other who's voting for who for president in the U.S. And I've gotten to a point where I realize whoever's voting for somebody, it doesn't really matter because we're not separate. So, to make it like, there's a famous teacher who I admire a lot. I don't think she's where, she doesn't talk about what we do, but it's Marianne Williamson. She's like, you've got to get out there. You've got to get out there and vote for, against Trump because of that, blah, 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 blah. And I'm not saying I'm not going to vote, but I don't get into the story because I don't understand. If you truly hear what the Course is saying, we never left God. So what's going to happen is going to happen. So I'm a little confused by people and I understand this is a play, so that's her job, I guess. Is that the way I should look at it? Because sometimes like my friends that are very beautiful to me love President Trump. And then they send me things that, whatever's going on, and I just love them. I just cannot say to them they are wrong. Why would I? If I truly am following these teachings, why would I say they were wrong? What do you have to say about that?
Yes, I agree. Some political parties are going to deliver much more to some people than another political party, and another political party is going to deliver more to someone else. So it would seem normal for people that are going to benefit from one party being in power to favor that one, and for other people to favor the other one. So for us to conflate that and to miss the fact that that's why someone wants one party and someone else wants another, and to then just think that everyone needs to think like us, or like what I want, is missing the point. So I agree with you, and because everyone has their very complex situation. I think you're right, is you just decide who you prefer. The only thing you have available to make a difference is your vote, which will take you about half an hour or 10 minutes or an hour on one day in 4 years. So just place the vote, and then the rest of it you can leave up to everyone else, because it's a whole lot of wasted energy.
That's what I see. And the movie's in the can. Like, I've heard that you say it, but I've known that because I've read so many of these, non-dual things. This is a movie. Well, how it's going to turn out, it's going to turn out. Isn't that so?
Yes, I don't. I agree. We we don't know how it's going to turn out, but it will turn out one way.
Well, we could actually like treat it like that. Like instead of being afraid, say, I'm curious to see how this will be. That's all I can, because what I find is, and this happens a lot with course students, and I'm not saying they're wrong. They can't help it. They continue to just fight. And I just sit there and think, well, did they really read the course? Because it says you're not, you're still in God. So what? But I'm not laughing at them. I'm just trying to just be as kind. And yet, I fall back into the mind. The mind still is talking, but I don't want to make a big deal out of anything anymore, Roger. I just want to let all of it go, because guess what? It's painful to fight against a mirage. Let's face it.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are gaining from getting involved in these discussions, because I think there's a lot of people that get involved and then they realize, my God, this is suffering. My own suffering, uh,
Right.
not Rogers, but whoever's getting involved.
Uh-huh.
Um, and there's this natural movement that realizes it, and then it gets less once it's been realized. And sometimes these extreme situations that have been put in that, or that are happening at the moment, for example, because of a lot of situations that are not normal or not usual, are dividing people and creating this involvement. And there are a lot of people that are just dropping out, not wanting to be on social media because of the fact that it can drag you into other people's ideologies or resisting other people's ideologies. And so there's a lot of people realizing that this movement needs to stop for themselves. So there's
Yeah, but there really
positives in
isn't
it.
like, I know I'm a separate person, but the exercise you did today, I already know there's, look, just knowing there's no reference point, reading a lot of Sailor Bob stuff, reading a lot of a lot of people that are there that I that speak to my heart. To me, they're not even making the decision. That's what I think. I think the decision is just happening. That's all. And
Mm,
if we just leave it as, like, for instance, pain in the body was happening yesterday. Was I going to
that's it.
not take something? That's crazy to me to suffer. Why would I suffer in a dream? You know what I'm
Hmm.
saying? Could I transcend that suffering? That's what I used to think, Roger. And it was very painful to think that I could, because I tried and tried. Guess what happened? I made it more intense because of the power that I have. Right.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I just appreciate your teachings. They're very helpful for where I am right now. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.